The content of this episode is for informational and educational purposes only and reflects the opinions and research of the hosts, contributors, and guests. While every effort has been made to ensure the accuracy of the information presented, the producers of Varied Voices make no guarantees regarding its completeness or reliability. The statements, testimonials, and correspondences discussed in this episode are based on publicly available information, personal interviews, and personal correspondence. Any references to individuals, organizations, or entities are based on facts at the time of recording and are not intended to defame, disparage, or harm their reputation. This episode may include graphic content, opinions, and interpretations that some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. The views expressed by guests and contributors are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the producers or hosts of Varied Voices. The producers and hosts assume no responsibility or liability for actions taken by listeners based on the content of this episode. Listeners are encouraged to do their own research and consult with appropriate professionals if they seek legal, psychological, or other expert advice. Not everyone that Fred Waterfield and David Gore targeted ended up in an unmarked grave, thankfully. There were some people who slipped through their fingers. There were women who came face to face with pure evil and still lived to tell a tale. These are the stories of the ones who got away. Starting with Diane Sullivan Smalley, it's their first known victim, June 22nd, 1976.
Yes, I remember this when it happened also because it was just so bizarre. So at approximately 5:36 o'clock, Diane Smalley was from Coral Gables, and she was on her way to Lake Wales. She got on the interstate, and she got off at Yeehaw Junction. And that's where the killing cousins saw her and started to follow her. About 15 minutes after leaving the truck stop, she didn't quite know, it sounded like somebody was shooting at her. And she started looking on both sides, out that's in the middle of nowhere, especially back then, still is. And she was looking from one side to the other thinking, well, that maybe they were hunters, that the bullets were accidentally coming across the interstate. And then all of a sudden, shortly thereafter, tires went flat or a tire went flat and she had to come to a stop. And then the cousins pulled up beside her and asked if she needed help. And she said, yes, I do.
And wasn't it said that David was a very good marksman and very good at hunting?
Yes, very much so. And they would have had to be, right?
Right, to hit a tire from a distance
at night.
The dark.
Right. And so here she was on a desolate highway, and these two guys pull up and say, oh, do you need help? And she said, yes. She gets out of the car, and then the next thing she knows, Fred Waterfield put a gun in her ribs and said, get into the back seat of the car, which she did. She got in the back seat, and at that point, David went up to her car and started rummaging through her car and grabbed her suitcase. And in her suitcase, I'm just going to mention this, was a gun that she had in her suitcase. And they ended up taking that gun, which was used in several other of the murders and abductions. So she was in the back of the car, and at one point she tried to say something to Waterfield, and he told her to shut up. And all of a sudden she saw headlights coming, from one direction, and she jumped out of the vehicle and jumped in front of this car, and the car stopped and picked her up, and she escaped the killing cousins, and they took off.
That's incredibly brave.
Right.
To take such a risk.
Yeah.
You don't know if you're going to be able to get away. And if you don't, if you fail at getting out of that car, what are they going to do to you now? Or you do jump out of that car and then maybe you break your neck.
Yeah. Well, killing cousins or being hit by a car. I would take being hit by a car, right?
I would take the car and the bear.
Yeah, exactly. She got away. And then our next victim, because she was a victim, she wasn't killed, but she was a victim, is Angelica Hummel. And I don't know if you remember this one, Stephanie, but she had met her husband in Germany. He was stationed in Germany, Bob, and she ended up young, coming over at age 19 to the States with her husband, and that didn't go so well. But during the time of their marriage, her husband introduced her to Fred Waterfield. That's how she initially got to know him. He said that he had played football in high school with him, and that, he's a good guy to know because if you ever have a problem with your car, he can fix it.
And I wonder how much the husband knew.
You do question that, but I've got some insight on that into my investigation of this case. When I was going through Angelica Hummel's file in the Indian River Sheriff's Department's 25 files of this case, and I was reading it, I came across a neighbor's name who Bob Hummel were friends with him, his brother, and after they were getting a divorce or almost divorced, he was living on their parents' property. So they all knew one another and they knew Waterfield and Gore. So of course, I called to get information. And I'm not going to give his name because he really didn't want his name mentioned. But he told me, well, first, I guess I'll tell the story of what happened to Angelica because he then became a witness as to what happened to her. So she wakes up one morning, was going to go to work. I think she was working as a CNA, and she goes out to her car and her tires are flat. Somehow, either the husband called Fred, there's been a couple of renditions of this, or she called Fred, I don't remember what, but he said, I'll help you. And he says, this is going to take some time, so I'll drive you to work. So off they went. And all of a sudden, he took this weird turn that was not going towards her work, but it was going into a grove. And she was like, where are you going? He goes, oh, don't worry about it. I know a shortcut. And he drove her back into this grove, and then he acted like the car got stuck. He goes, well, I'll be right back. At this point, Angelica knows something's really wrong, but she's in the middle of a grove in the evening and she doesn't know which way to go. She was worried about alligators because, hey, that's a real thing in Florida, right? So she was just like confused but scared. She was alarmed, and he came back with his cousin. So there was Fred and David.
And now the car is suddenly unstuck?
Well, no. I mean, it really wasn't that stuck, I guess, but she knew that there was a problem at this point. And all of a sudden, there was a weapon pulled, and David Gore was demanding that, she do this and that. And Fred at first was just kind of like acting, remember the good guy, bad guy routine that they play? He started out like that. Oh, well, I guess we're going to have to comply. But quickly, she was smart enough to understand that he was part of it.
Right. So this is when they remove her from the car, they assault her.
No, they're assaulting her in this big Lincoln Continental.
Oh.
And they are nasty. They are disgusting, she said. They are fat, and Waterfield, she said, stunk to high heavens. And he had been smoking pot, and they were probably drinking, and it was just like, it was horrible. And they both raped her. And then they did horrible things like, I don't know that we need to go into it, but both of them were at play here. And the discussion was to kill her. And she said, Fred, I'm not a U.S. citizen. I'm a German citizen, and that won't go away. And my father is high ranking in the German army. So they're going to come looking for you, and they're going to link you to Bob. And it's not a smart thing to do. So she used her wits. She got her wits about her. And all of a sudden, Fred Waterfield was like, I'm taking her back. And David Gore was like, really, man? Are you sure? Are you sure? And he goes, yes, she'll be fine. She won't tell. And he took her back. So what happened next, she goes in the house. She calls Bob. Bob's like I said, I had a neighbor that knew them all. And he was living on this family property in a trailer. He had just gotten a divorce. And my neighbor friend was with Bob when Angelica called. They had carved on her stomach. And from what my neighbor said, that, Stephanie, you're too young, but back in 76, they had beer cans with tabs on them. And they took that and they were carving on her stomach. And she called Bob, was crying, they raped me, this happened. Bob said, come get me and we're going to go to the hospital. So when they got there, my neighbor and Bob were there, and she showed them. And I asked my neighbor, I said, did you believe her? He said, absolutely. Absolutely, I believed her. So at that point, Bob took her to the hospital. And then the authorities were called in, and they absolutely dropped the ball. Fred Waterfield was an football player for Vero Beach High. We're talking back in 1976, and they were giving her not any credibility. They told her she didn't pass the lie detector. David Gore in 1976, his uncle was a sheriff deputy. So it was the good old boys back then. I don't know how else to say it, but 1976, it was run by good old boys. And they didn't believe her, and they let these guys go. And it wasn't prosecuted.
Even though she had physical evidence on her.
And she said that there was a female detective that accused her of being part of it. And it's a very sad story. And do you know what's so interesting about Angelica Hummel is that when Gore was sentenced to death, she is a devout Catholic, and she doesn't believe in the death penalty. And she spoke out against him being put to death. And she fought for him to be taken off of death row.
That's really interesting. I battle with that myself because at one point I think, resources, why spend them on these people that probably should die? And then I also think, but death is too easy for people who do horrible crimes.
I heard something recently. I can't tell you where in all our TV crime stuff, but actually, and it may have been Angelica Hummel when I listened to her herself on Murder Phone podcast tell this horrible story. But somewhere along the way, I read that it's more money to kill them than to keep them incarcerated. I don't know. Where I stand on the death penalty, I just feel that we are a civilized society, and I don't feel right about it. I feel like it's medieval, but not to say that if it was a family member of mine, let him go. I'd handle it. That's how I feel about it. I mean, I understand how a family member would want to see them put to death. Absolutely. And many people have said to me that Fred Waterfield, including, he didn't say it to me, but I saw him say it after David Gore was put to death. Lynn Elliott's father said that Fred Waterfield was every bit as guilty, and he was the brains of the operation. And no matter where I'm at, and they find out that I'm doing this podcast about Gore and Waterfield. People that have lived here as long as I have. I was just at a party, and the guys that have grown up here, and they knew him. One had gone hunting with David Gore and his dad. He says, oh my God, he was a great hunter. He goes, but he wasn't very bright. And everybody says the same thing. Waterfield was the brains, and David Gore would have done anything his cousin told him to do.
Yeah, he was just like the henchman. So there's still another survivor that we do know about. Can you tell us about Peggy Capellan?
Well, she was not one of the ones that they were prosecuted on because they didn't hear about her until much later. So Lois Capellan and her daughters lived across the street from Fred Waterfield, his wife, and their twin daughters. Jackie Capellan, her younger sister, who was 12 at the time, would babysit the twins. When, in 1983, they were captured after Lynn Elliott and Regan Martin case, they were incarcerated. Lois, the mother of Peggy and Jackie, was really standing by Fred Waterfield, her neighbor. She says, I know he's not guilty. I think that his cousin did it all and is just pulling him in. And her 24-year-old daughter at the time, Peggy, said, Mom, he's not a good guy. And she says, why do you say that? And she said, because he raped me when I was 14. And then as the mother delved into it, her younger sister, Jackie, who used to babysit for the cousins, told a story of Fred Waterfield coming home one day and attacking her. And she fought him. And then the mother, his wife, drove in and, she ran out, and it doesn't sound like the wife believed her, but he apologized and life went on. And then, of course, later her older sister was raped by him.
It's like what you said earlier, that it's hard to put yourself in that situation of assault and rape if you've never been there, and to imagine what you would do as a response. But in a world where the victims are often not believed and actually even blamed,
especially in 1976,
exactly. It's so disheartening. So this is another example of the victim not being believed and actually being put down in some way. So it goes back to how many others were there, either close calls or assault victims.
Right, exactly. There's got to be more, as you can see by the timeline and how often that they did that. It was like Lee, my husband, said, well, what happened between 1976 and 1981. Do you think nothing happened? No, we don't think that. I mean, I'm sure that this was an activity that they did quite often. And we don't know how many victims, just like Peggy, didn't come forward because they didn't feel they would be believed, which is a shame. But when David Gore was finally arrested in the backseat of Marilyn Owens' car, did we talk about that? She's another survivor. Yeah.
No.
Okay, so Marilyn Owens is another survivor that in 1981, so she fell into, July of 1981, David Allen Gore was on the hunt again, and he saw this pretty blonde girl walk into the doctor's clinic. And so he got inside her car in the back seat. He was back there with his usual rape kit, a gun, tape, all the things that he would need, drunk. And there was a deputy going in at that point, and she had seen him pop his head up, Marilyn did. And she went to the deputy, says, there is a guy in the back seat of my car. Oh my gosh. So they go out there, they arrested David, and he served time from 1981, and he got out in, Gore was released from prison March 15th, 1983. And then in May, Waterfield moved back to Vero Beach. He closed his shop in Orlando and moved back. And then they started. Boom, boom, boom. Went right back to it as soon as David got out of prison. So there was nothing that was going to stop these guys. So Lynn Elliott is a true hero.
Yes. Rest in peace, Lynn Elliott.
Right. I'm glad we could have a voice for the victims and the survivors for this.
Another survivor is Dana Sturgis. There was an attempted kidnapping of Dana Sturgis in July of 1981.
Yes. So she had pulled out of a street and on A1A, I guess. And so David Gore was in his auxiliary sheriff's car, and he pulled her over and stated that she was going too fast and he wanted to see her driver's license, and then made up a story that she had been witness to a robbery and he wanted her to follow him back to the place and talk to her about that. And so she thought it was strange, but he had her license. So she followed him, and he went down a road off of A1A. And lucky for Dana Sturgis is when they got back there were some fishermen that saw him and saw them. And so at that point, it was foiled. And he gave her back her license and said, called it off and just said, well, they're not here anymore, so you can go. Well, she was very perplexed by it. She went home and she told her father, and her father ended up calling the sheriff's department, and they got to David Gore's supervisor, who placed a call to him and said, did this happen? And he said, yes. And he was questioned about it, and he made up some excuses, said, well, I'll just resign. And that's when he resigned from the auxiliary sheriff's department. But Dana Sturgis got away, slipped through the fingers of David Gore at that point. Just to recount what happened to me in 1983, I was 21 years old, and my roommate and I, Bev, we used to go get up early in the morning before work and go run. And we lived near the 17th Street Bridge. I always ran toward the traffic with the traffic coming at me. So that morning, it was dawn. I ran by myself. Bev didn't want to get up, so we did that sometimes. So I set out by myself, and I was going up. I was on the eastbound lane, so the traffic westbound was coming towards me. And as I got to the tip of the bridge, I noticed a van that came up headed eastbound, and I watched it go down. And when it went down, it turned around the barricades. And I knew that meant trouble. As it started to come back up, I jumped over the barricade. There was a concrete barricade, still exists today. I jumped over and I waited. And he made another U-turn on 17th Street and came back on Indian River Boulevard and came back up the 17th Street Bridge. I jumped over again, and I watched him go down and make that U-turn and stop and look at me. Now, I couldn't see anyone in the van. I just remember I couldn't see it. Maybe I was just afraid. I don't know. Maybe it was blacked out. I don't know. But it was like a chicken. And I put my hand on my hip and I just shook my head no. Like he was not going to get on the same side as me. And as he started back up again, I jumped over again. He went down, came back, And I jumped over one more time. I watched him go all the way down to A1A and he turned north, and I waited because I wanted to make sure he wasn't going to go a little bit down on North A1A and flip around and come back, and then he'd be on my side. He did not. And then I ran down to Indian River Boulevard. And when I got down at the end, it was before they brought Indian River Boulevard completely through to US 1. So there was a dead end on the south side of the bridge on Indian River Boulevard. And parked there were 2 state troopers that had pulled up there having coffee or whatever. And that's what made him give up. Besides the fact that I don't know how he ever would have got on the same side as me. And Stephanie, at that time, what would I have told them? Because the guy was gone. But I ran back to my townhome. I got in my car and I went looking for the van because I wanted to get a license plate. I was so mad that I hadn't gotten a license plate because I knew at that moment I would never run by myself in the wee hours of the morning. I mean, they had changed my life.
That's very persistent of you to not only escape a potential kidnapping, but then I also go after the assailant.
When you want to get, the license plate and be able to give a name.
Oh, yeah.
So I did drive around for a little bit, but did not come across the van again. But there was this was a small town back then. And I moved here in 1977. So that happened to me, but also one of my best friends, her name was Cindy Lukedemeyer. We used to go skating on adult skate night at this skating rink here in Vero Beach, and she didn't skate. So she would meet up with us, and because afterwards, it was adult skate night, and afterwards, we'd all go over to the Bamboo Lounge, have some beers and talk and whatnot. So she walked into the Bamboo Lounge that night, and she looked around, and she had long, beautiful blonde hair. She looked around, she didn't see us. So she turned around and walked back out to the parking lot. And when she walked out to the parking lot, it was very desolate, very dark. Somebody came up behind her with scissors in their hand and grabbed her around her neck. And she immediately, started pleading with this person to let her go. She was a Christian. Don't hurt her. And he says, I just want to cut your hair. Let me cut your hair. And he had cut her hand. But she let him cut her hair off. Cindy was the maid of honor in my wedding, and this happened to her. So shortly thereafter, they caught David Allen Gore and Fred Waterfield for the Lynn Elliott murder and kidnapping. And the description of Fred Waterfield's truck fit the description that Cindy had of the truck that this guy jumped into. It was a Chevrolet and it had a mural in the back window. And at that time, because this was big news, I said, Cindy, don't you want to let the officers know that you think this is the guy that did it because of the description of the truck? And she wanted no part of that, because if they found her hair, then they could link that. She was completely freaked out by it. Again, I've never been an actual victim. Yes, I could have been somebody that they had kidnapped, but they didn't, thankfully. So I can't say that how I would react to actually being a victim. But she did not want to. But again, another possible victim around the same time. I mean, if you look at the timeline, Cindy and I both kind of fit in there in the summer of 1983, and they were active, very active. What I've learned from this, and I don't know about you, Stephanie, but, fight like hell if you ever find yourself in a situation of an abduction. Don't go quietly.
Maybe don't trust so easily.
No, because you think about some of these people that thought, well, yeah, I can get in the car and go to the 7-Eleven and make a phone call.
They're trying to help me. Right. I'm in trouble. My car's broken down.
And how many times have we actually done that, right? We trusted somebody. So we've all been in that situation, but a true crime story like this makes you realize that there are hunters out there that are predators and they're looking for an opportunity. You just never want to put yourself in that situation. And if you find yourself in a situation like that, make noise, don't go quietly.
Thankfully, being in the world of connectivity, we're able to call and reach for help. I mean, the women in the 80s,
they had no phones, right?
No phones, no. She literally needed a ride to get to a payphone.
Right. I think technology has helped us a lot. In the 70s, there were, that's when they said it was the decade of the serial killers. And I just wonder, and that's something I did want to ask Dr. Ramslin about, is has it changed now, crime, with all the technology that's out there? It's really hard and difficult to do a crime like that nowadays. So that certainly has helped us, and certainly as women, it helps us to be connected always and to be able to use our phone.
Yes, and I still believe in having someone you trust know your location on your phone at all times. Doesn't mean they're looking at it, but just having it in your back pocket is a good thing.
Whether it's your best friend, your husband, your boyfriend, or whatever, just so that people can identify where you are.
Thank you for sticking with us on this multi-part series on David Gore and Fred Waterfield. The case of David Gore and Fred Waterfield is a haunting reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight. For years, their crimes terrorized a community, leaving behind a legacy of loss, unanswered questions, and lasting pain for the families and their victims. While justice was served in the courtroom, the scars do remain. Through these conversations, we aim to shed light on the truth, examine the complexities of the case, and remember those whose voices were tragically silenced. As we close this chapter, we encourage you to question, to seek the facts, and to never forget the importance of justice for the victims and their loved ones. I'm your host, Stephanie.
And I'm your host, Patty.
Thank you for listening to Varied Voices, where every story matters.